My name is Ruben Nelson, and it's my pleasure and my honor to introduce William Rees, known to his friends as Bill. If you know anything about the state of the world today, the kind of trouble we're in, the odds are you've run across some of his work even though you didn't know it. For example, Bill is the inventor, the creator of the ecological footprint concept. He then worked it out with his graduate students at UBC. And of course, I assume most of you know that there's wonderful websites where you can learn about your own impact on the world, the impact of others, because of the work that Bill and his graduate students did years ago to invent the concept of the ecological footprint. Bill may be the wisest ecologist who's still practicing today. That's my judgment, but of course, I don't know them all. I invited Bill to work with me in Seattle a little over a year ago, and sight unseen, he agreed. And one of the things you might do is go to YouTube, Google his name, and look at his presentation under the heading of Will Modern Civilization Be the Death of Us? You will find it is brilliant. Bill has been honored by many organizations. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. I will not list them all. I'm old enough, as you can tell, that when milk was delivered, the cream was still at the top of the bottle. And Bill, like that cream, has risen to the top. Mark his words. They're important. Bill, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ruben, for a very flattering introduction. And welcome, everyone. I'm very glad that we can all get together today. It's an honor to me to be invited to speak with you. So do we just go straight to screen share? Hello?
Yes, go to screen share.
Yes, go to screen share.
So the title of this talk, I suppose, is deserving of some explanation. My basic premise is that humankind is extremely smart, able to manipulate the physical world in ways that are sometimes extraordinary, really. But we're not nearly smart enough to rescue ourselves from the dilemma that we've created through our manipulation of the physical world. So I want to start with a series of premises. Whoops, why am I going forward? The first of these is that human beings are not primarily a rational species. We like to think of ourselves as being intelligent. We call ourselves Homo sapiens, or intelligent or wise man, but we are not primarily rational. In fact, passion and instinct often trump reason, particularly in times of crises. The second premise that I want to emphasize is that human beings don't actually live in or experience reality. We socially construct our realities. And more accurately, we construct stories, conceptual lenses, or even keyholes through which we perceive reality. So when you think about it, all of our political ideologies, our religious doctrines, economic paradigms, even our scientific models and cultural narratives are socially constructed stories that we've put together. We make life up we make reality up as we go along. Now, there are some very important corollaries to that fact. And the first is that the conceptual lenses through which we perceive reality determine the nature of the reality that we perceive. The second problem is really flows from that one, that people live out of our constructed realities as if they were real. In other words, we take our constructs much more seriously than we do the reality in which we are actually embedded. Which leads me to my third premise. And that is that we cannot regulate our interaction with any aspect of reality that our models of reality do not include. So if we think again that all of our political ideologies, religious doctrines, scientific models, and so on are constructs, models of reality, the fact is that if those models don't include some important aspect of biophysical reality or social reality, then we are beyond our depth. We cannot deal with that aspect that is outside of our model. So we can put that as a corollary again. When the variety or complexity of the environment exceeds the capacity of any regulatory system, whether natural or artificial, the environment will dominate and ultimately destroy that system. This is a variation of what's known as Ashby's law of requisite variety. Another way of saying it is that any regulatory system has to have the internal variety or complexity of the system that is regulating. And if it does not, it will fail, which is the second way of putting it here on this page. A social construct or model is more likely to succeed the closer it maps to any external biophysical reality it purports to represent. Okay, so in that context, by the way, a premise is simply something I'm going to take for granted. I consider these things to be facts beyond dispute. And if we put it in that context, then we have to look at this as well. Climate change, despite our social fixation on it, is not the major problem facing society today. In fact, thinking climate change as the primary existential threat just reflects Homo sapiens' limited capacity to cope with complexity. And this is really mechanistic or Cartesian reductionism at play. Modern society is based on a very reductionist way of approaching the world. And it's problematic because if climate change isn't the problem, we can't even solve that problem by focusing on climate change. So I'm going to make the argument that the major difficulty facing us is something called ecological overshoot. Ecological overshoot is a macro problem, and climate change is merely one of many symptoms, a number of which I've listed here as well. And they go from the obviously biophysical to the fact that income gaps are widening even as global wealth accumulates. So we have a situation in which we have a macro problem, which is the source of all of these others. And the fact is we can't solve any of them in isolation from the others. Focusing on climate change is doomed to failure. Overshoot implies a number of problems, but the major factor to look at from the biophysical perspective is this one, and it comes out of our ecological footprint analyses. Every human being, whether conscious of it or not, requires the constant productivity and assimilation capacity of a certain area on the surface of the earth. And we've developed a method by which we can compute that for individuals or cities or nations, or for that matter, the whole world. And to put it in a nutshell, right now on planet Earth, there are about 12 billion productive hectares able to support the kinds of activities that humans need to survive. But we are using the planet as if there were 20.9 billion hectares. So the human ecological footprint of 20.9 billion hectares exceeds the actual area of productive land and waterscape on the planet by about 73%. How can that be? Even a school child, I could give a talk like this to school children, and the first question is, how can we be occupying a planet larger than we have? And the answer is that we're simply consuming and dissipating other species, ecosystems, resources much more quickly than nature can regenerate them. And we're dumping waste into the system much faster than nature can assimilate them. This is the very definition of unsustainability and is ultimately bound to be fatal. The question is, how can we get ourselves into, or how did we get ourselves into this kind of situation? And I would argue that there are several causes for this, but the two that we can take most seriously are the reality that human beings are programmed to be unsustainable by nature. This is a fact of our biology, our success in our evolution. And the reality is that humans, unless we are constrained by negative feedback, by disease, war, resource shortages, or anything of that nature, like all other species, will expand to occupy all accessible habitat, and we will use all available resources. And humans have a leg up in that game because of our technology. Human beings are constantly increasing the availability of resources through improvements, refinements in technology. So we have a biological predisposition to constantly grow, use everything up, and to fill all available habitats. It's not unique to humans by any stretch of the imagination. This is the means by which any species survives. This was a really interesting story a few years ago where we saw a group of monkeys who learned to crack open clamshells with rocks, tool using animals such as humans, and they're very quickly pushing local shellfish stocks to extinction. So it's a characteristic of organisms that once they acquire an abundant source of resources, they will use them all up. The second factor in this is cultural nurture. And I would say that this is the social misconstruction of reality. So I've made the point that we construct our realities, and in this case, it's a gross misconstruction. So the dominant narrative of our modern techno-industrial society is something called neoliberal economics. Certainly, it's the underlying theme that drives much of global development. The problem is that this is a construct that separates the economy from the environment and considers the economy to be essentially independent of any constraints imposed by the biophysical environment. One of the mental tricks that we use to do that is to assume that human ingenuity or technology can create substitutes for any potentially limiting natural resource. In this model, ethical and moral considerations are irrelevant. Damage to ecosystems and communities are considered to be mere externalities. So we have a situation then, which is based on another social construct coming out of the Enlightenment, really, that is of human exceptionalism. Underpinning much of our modern techno-industrial society is the idea that humans are not constrained by the laws of nature. So again, we see models such as this in textbooks where the economy is separate from the environment and free of constraints. Of course, there's an exchange of energy and resources, but once you believe that human ingenuity can overcome any resource scarcity, then this becomes irrelevant. So this is what shows up in typical economics textbooks. This is what we regard as the economy. It's a perpetual self-feeding flow of energy and material, and resources, goods and services produced by businesses to households in exchange for wages and salaries. But of course, households provide labor and investments to businesses in exchange for goods and services. So we have a double counterflow of entities here, but you'll notice there's no reference whatsoever to the biophysical environment, which contains the entire system. So it follows from our prevailing economic logic that economic growth can continue indefinitely, propelled by boundless technological progress. This is expressed most appropriately, or perhaps most exuberantly, by Julian Simon, the late Professor Simon of Management Studies at the University of Maryland. We have in our hands now the technology to feed, clothe, and supply energy to an ever-growing population for the next 7 billion years. This is, by the way, one of the most arithmetically challenged assertions ever to come out of economists, but it's one that a lot of people like to take seriously. Now, what's missing from this is a very simple biophysical fact that all human activity, every act we undertake, and indeed all real events are what we call dissipative. Every activity results in the permanent dissipation or irreversible loss of all of the energy and of a significant proportion of the material involved. The important flows in the economy are not the unidirectional flows of abstract money value, as textbooks suggest, but rather the unidirectional and irreversible flows of energy and matter. So this is what the textbook model ought to look like. We see then the circular flows model of goods and services, countercurrent with spending on these, is actually sustained by a continuous extraction of available energy and material from the biophysical environment. These are so-called low entropy resources. They move through the economy, but all of it is ejected back into the environment as pollution and waste. Even the final products of the economy are eventually dissipated and degraded back into the environment as high entropy wastes. Okay, so we have two factors then combining. The first is the natural predisposition of humans to expand both in population terms and into habitats, and the imposition on top of that of a reinforcing social construct in the form of neoliberal unlimited growth economics. And if we look at this in context, think of it, it took 350,000 years, roughly that's the entire life of modern humans, for the human population to hit 1 billion in the early 1800s. Since then, in a scarce 200 years, we've added an additional 7.5 billion people. And pardon me, we've expanded 7.5-fold. One 1/1700th of this much time has resulted in a population 7-fold larger, so that we've actually now reached 7.8 billion in 2020 or 2021. Meanwhile, gross world product increased by over 100-fold, and per capita incomes increased by a factor of 13, as much as 25 in rich countries. So we've had this massive expansion of the human enterprise, but Earth didn't get any larger. This is what it looks like. These, again, are real numbers. Keep in mind that this is just 10,000 years of our 350,000 years of human evolutionary history. It's not even, that's just of modern man. So that the x-axis could actually extend over into the next county. And then suddenly, right toward the end of this 350,000 year period, we see this enormous and inordinate expansion. Now, there are two very important points to take from this. The first is that it was the combination of technology, and particularly the use of fossil fuels, that made the explosive growth of the human enterprise possible early in the 19th century. So we are entirely the product of fossil fuels. The second thing to keep in mind is that only the last 8 or 10 generations of people have enjoyed sufficient growth or technological change in their lifetimes to notice it. And yet, out of thousands of generations of people, we take the last 10 generations or so to be the norm. And the second point to take from this graph is that, in fact, continuous population and economic growth is an anomaly. This growth spurt that we take to be the norm is the single most abnormal period in human history. And I want you to keep the shape of this curve in mind as we move forward. Here are some of the proofs of what I've just asserted. A population has grown 6-fold since this is between 1850 and 2017. It was empowered by a 9-fold increase in the use of energy, and total consumption has gone up by a factor of 55 times. So per capita consumption, 9 times, 55 times increase in the total consumption of energy in that period. This is the power of exponential growth shown in this curve. By the way, we don't replace one form of energy with another, we simply add them together. So wood became, coal was added to wood, and oil was added to coal, and natural gas is added to oil, and now we're adding so-called renewable energies to natural gas, but there's no real displacement, as we'll see in a moment. Because of this exponential growth, however, 50% of all the fossil fuels ever consumed have been consumed in just the past 30 years. 90% of fossil fuels ever used have been used in my lifetime. So these are extremely recent phenomena, and of course are the drivers of climate change. Everything else has exploded in kind. It doesn't really matter what we plot. We've seen this exponential growth in almost everything that human beings use and take advantage of. And incidentally, this has taken place, particularly in the last 50 years, during a period of unprecedented increases in technological efficiency. So many people expect efficiency to rescue us from the problem. In fact, efficiency is the primary, or one of the primary movers of growth. So economics is divorced from biophysical and social reality. Our mainstream economics, and again, these are social constructs, products of the human mind with not any necessary connection to reality, in fact, contain no useful information about the structure or dynamic properties, the interdependence, lags, thresholds, discontinuous behaviors, and so on, of the real ecosystems or the social systems within which the economy operates in the real world. So remember, we are running the world with an economic system which in no way maps to the reality in which it finds itself. Well, what could possibly go wrong? And of course, plenty. The best known symptom, as I said at the outset, is perhaps climate change. And here we see the steady uptick of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in the last 60 or so years. Since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we've seen a 45% increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide. Humans are literally changing the biochemistry of the planet on which we live. And of course, there's the temperature effect as well. These are simply the corresponding temperature graphs. We've seen a steady increase, particularly in recent decades. The past 7 years have been the warmest on record, with 2020 and 2016 tied as the warmest years in the instrumental record. But here's a lesser known symptom. And again, I want to underscore that these are all related. You cannot solve any of these in isolation from any of the others. So if we go back 10,000 years, our best estimates of terrestrial biomass shows that wild mammals were about 99% of the total, and humans less than 1%. Now, since then, over the 10,000 year period, we've seen about a 4 to 7-fold increase in the biomass, but now humans themselves constitute 30 to 34%. Our livestock constitute another 60-odd%, and wild mammals have been reduced to a mere 1.5% of the total mammalian biomass on the planet. We've literally competitively displaced most other mammalian species from their habitats and food resources. So the expansion of humanity has real consequences. It's not just mammals. Wild bird populations are tumbling. Domestic poultry now constitutes 70% of the world's bird biomass. Average populations of thousands of monitored species of wild vertebrates have declined 60% since 1970. And the populations of invertebrates are also in free fall. So it's a generalized phenomenon caused by habitat displacement. And the simple fact of the matter is that what humans require and take is simply unavailable for other species. So we are living most of our lives in the last couple of hundred years in particular under a grand shared illusion. And I think one of the most important elements of this is the notion that there is no conflict between the growth of the human enterprise and the conservation of the environment. I don't know how many times I've heard our various senior politicians, including Prime Minister Trudeau, proclaim there's no contradiction between continuous economic growth and conservation of nature. This is simply demonstrably untrue. The continuous growth of the human enterprise on a finite planet necessarily means the displacement of non-human species. Modern humans are in fact systematically destroying the biophysical existence of their own, the biophysical basis of their own existence. So what's the solution? It's not that we're unaware of these problems, but modern technological society is completely self-referencing. Once we have a mental construct of the nature of reality, we keep referring to it for solutions to the problem that it creates. So our solutions tend to be more growth through technology. And we can illustrate this again in just two domains. If you think of population, when I was in school back in the 60s, the population planning was one of the key issues that we discussed in biology, and it was certainly something on the international stage. Population planning became the dominant policy discussion back in the 60s. But by 2018, it became the least researched of all, so that most of the literature today And here's a quote: "We find a strong and increasing focus on feeding the world through increasing food production via new technologies." So away from planning to simply satisfying the demand, no matter how large it gets, which of course means a continuation of the displacement of non-human life. If we look at climate change, we see exactly the same kind of thinking taking place. We know from the Paris Agreement that we need to reduce our carbon emissions by about 50% below 2010 levels in just 9 years. That's over 7% per year beginning now. We're not going to do this. We need to have complete decarbonization by 2050. And more recent studies suggest that really should be 2030. So that's what we should be doing. But what are the politically acceptable solutions from within our current paradigm? And the answer is simple. Any capital intensive investment, such as wind and solar power, that will maintain the existing growth-based economic order is acceptable. Any discussion of conservation, demand reduction, lifestyle changes, more equitable distribution of the existing wealth are simply not on the table. Some authors have described, I've quoted Clive Spash here, disaster policy is being designed to serve the capitalist growth-based or modern techno-industrial society so that the latter becomes the solution to, instead of the cause of, the problem, a complete perceptual delusion. Sometimes editorial cartoonists say it all, and I think this is one of the most obvious ways to express exactly what I'm saying. There's an irony in all of this, even among those who think climate change is the problem, and that is that continued growth inhibits the green energy transition. And I just want to illustrate from the most recent data available. Primary energy consumption on the planet is growing twice as fast as is renewable energy production. So it has to be filled by what? Fossil fuels. Even in electricity, where most of the renewable energy progress is being made, demand has increased by 1.3%. That's total demand for electricity. But generation by non-hydro renewables, wind and solar in particular, has increased by less than that, even though the increase there is 13.6%. It's starting at a very much smaller base, but can't even keep up with the increased demand in electricity. And the bottom line of this unwinnable race is that in 2018, 2019, the last year for which we have data, the world remains 84% dependent on fossil fuels. We have to refer to biology again if we're going to begin to understand this. As matters stand, this is an extremely important point, the expansion of the human enterprise resembles the plague phase of a one-off boom-bust population cycle as it occurs in nature. So this is an illustration straight out of a biology textbook that describes this phenomenon, that most species will expand very rapidly in response to favorable conditions, abundant resources, but then collapse once those resources are depleted or predation becomes so demanding on their numbers that they crash. This is the standard model for how species behave under natural circumstances. What goes up will come down. And we can look at this example here from a couple of experiments, I suppose, on the Pribilof Islands off Alaska. Very rich in lichens, reindeer were introduced, populations expanded exactly according to the model we looked at a moment ago, and crashed when those abundant resources were eliminated. Now, in theory, humans should be able to avoid this uncontrolled collapse. So keep in mind, we are no different from other species. We have this tendency to expand, to use all resources, but we also have other qualities that they don't possess, such as high intelligence, the capacity for logical analysis, the ability to reason from the evidence. We are unique in our ability to plan ahead. We're the only species that can functionally alter its own future trajectory. We have the capacity to exercise moral judgment, which is to say, should we command such authority over nature and the destruction of other species? We have empathy and compassion for other people and other species. And we have uniquely diverse forms and institutions for cooperative behavior. So these are the highest, I think, some of the highest qualities that distinguish humans from other species. However, the exercise of these qualities are not the primarily determinants of human affairs. And I've just got 3 quotes here that illustrate over a period of more than a century what I'm getting at. Gustave Le Bon was one of the early psychologists in Europe, France. The masses have never thirsted after truth. They turn aside from evidence that is not to their taste, preferring to deify error if error seduces them. In other words, we prefer our socially constructed illusions to contrary evidence. Barbara Tuchman, the Pulitzer Prize winning American historian who wrote the book called The March of Folly, quote, "Wooden-headedness plays a remarkably large role in government. It consists in assessing a situation in terms of preconceived fixed notions while ignoring any contrary signs. It is acting according to wish while not allowing oneself to be deflected by the facts." Well, nothing much changed in the 100 years since Gustave Le Bon. Of course, she traces it way back to ancient history. Derek Jensen, in a little book called, what was it, A Language Before Words, says, "For us to maintain our way of living, we must tell lies to each other and especially to ourselves. The lies are necessary because without them, deplorable acts would become impossibilities." Now, how can we explain this conundrum? And I think part of it, again, it comes from our basic evolutionary biology. The human brain is a very complex organ. In very crude terms, we can say that there's really 3 brains here. The reptilian complex, which has some basic instinctive behaviors associated with it, including the fight or flight response, various ritualistic and instinctive behaviors. The midbrain is the limbic system. It's where our emotions, our feelings, our responses to food and sex occur. It's where bonding and attachment occur. It's one of our social sources of social memory. Both of those are rather ancient structures, and built on top of them is the cerebrum, the cortex or the neocortex or the new brain. This is the seat of logic and reason, of forward thinking and planning, of technical manipulation or extreme expertise at manipulating the physical environment, language and speech. So all of those higher intellectual qualities reside in that part of the brain, which is the least or the most recent arrival on the scene, as it were. And we live there, that we live in cerebral consciousness, but we're unaware of the hidden emotions and instincts that are equally important in the activities that we undertake. So we are a deeply conflicted species. Again, editorial cartoonists are brilliant. While the end of the world scenario may be rife with unimaginable horrors, we believe that the pre-end period is filled with unprecedented opportunities for profit. And we've all heard examples of that. And here's an example of how our conflicting instincts and intelligence have confounded any action on what we all seem to think of as the major symptom of the problem, climate change. Again, I refer here to this constant steady uptick in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but I've plotted on this a number of other points. The Limits to Growth volume was published in 1972. The world scientists' first warning to humanity was about 1992. We've seen over the 50-year period represented here, 34 climate conferences, half a dozen major international climate agreements, and various scientists' warning, all of which have failed utterly to reduce atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide, which of course is what they were intended to do. So on the one hand, we see what's happening. On the other, we don't do anything about it. Another brilliant cartoon. Assuming present trends continue, the odds are quite good that we will become the best informed extinct species on the planet. And we're beginning to understand, again, referring to our biology, some of what's going on here. It turns out that in the course of one's individual development, repeated sensory experiences or repeated experiences or exposures to cultural norms literally help shape the development of the brain's synaptic circuitry. So that in effect, our beliefs, values, and assumptions, our cultural paradigms or narratives acquire a physical presence in the brain. Subsequently, once this is embedded, people tend to seek out compatible experiences. They seek out people who think the same way they do. And then, quote, when faced with information that does not agree with our preformed internal structures, we deny, discredit, reinterpret, or forget that information. A wonderful little book that explains much of this is Bruce Wexler's Brain and Culture. And by the way, if you think of the political circumstances of the United States for the last several years, particularly during the Trump years, you'll see this writ large at the societal level. People simply ignoring reality in preference to their preformed internal structures, their prejudices, biases, and so on, social constructs all. To put it more simply, the problem with your reasoned solutions is that they don't fit my preconceived notions of the problem. So reason really does not hold much sway in the forum of political will. Now, things are actually getting worse because in recent years, there's been a deliberate attempt, we'd expand on this, I just took out a bunch of slides, but we've been socially engineered to ignore reality, which is why politics is increasingly influenced by not only neoliberal ideology, but religious fundamentalism, climate change denial, anti-intellectualism, and other forms of what is now called magical thinking. In 2016, this problem had become evident enough that the Oxford dictionaries defined their year of the, rather the word of the year as post-truth, defined as relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. So again, we see this incredible conflict within the human species of high intelligence, and yet that defers to the socially construct preferences that we have managed to come up with. So this is a new age of science denial and magical thinking. Another good cartoon. It's an enduring mystery. How did this extinct species combine such huge brains with such jaw-dropping stupidity? So what modern techno-industrial society refuses to acknowledge is that to act consistently with our best science may well require a planned economic and population contraction. So can humanity learn to live more equitably within the means of nature? This is the curve that really needs flattening. Of course, we've tended to focus almost exclusively, almost excluding climate change, on the pandemic in recent years, and flattening the curve has been the watchword for the last year and a half or so. And so what we ignore completely is the overshoot curve. That's the curve that really needs flattening, because with geometric growth of population beyond long-term carrying capacity, humankind has gone into a state of overshoot. And as long as we remain in that state of overshoot, we are literally consuming the resource base of the future. And in the course of doing so, we are reducing future carrying capacity. Fewer fish stocks, degraded soils, ruined forests cannot produce that which will be needed to sustain the ever-growing numbers of human beings. So that in the case of continuous overshoot, systems collapse becomes inevitable. The environment at some point can no longer sustain the demands being made on it by the population. So we really need to rethink our whole way of being on the planet. The green line represents one planet living, where people go through a period of growth, but then just as in our individual development, we defer to carrying capacity and level out well within the carrying capacity of the environment, and thus extend the duration of civilization. So we have a choice. The human enterprise is in critical overshoot. I don't think there's any doubt or real discussion any longer about that. We may be at or near a critical tipping point. In coming years, I don't think there's any question about this, the human enterprise will contract. Now, as an intelligent, plan-capable species, we can theoretically choose between a business as usual course, risking a chaotic implosion imposed by nature, followed by geopolitical turmoil and resource wars. And basically that's the tack we are currently on if you pay any attention to the news. Or we can have a well-planned, orderly, and cooperative descent toward a socially just sustainability for all. That's really the stark choice between us. So what would be required to eliminate overshoot? The first thing would be for our leadership to formally recognize the end of material growth and the need to drastically, and I mean dramatically, reduce the human ecological footprint. We have to also recognize the theoretical and practical difficulties, indeed impossibility, of an all-green, quantitatively equivalent energy transition. That's a huge story. We can perhaps talk about it later, but it's simply not happening. We have to acknowledge that as long as we remain in overshoot, sustainable production and consumption means less production and consumption. The only way to eliminate overshoot is through consuming less. If we face that reality, we must devise ways to assist communities, families, and individuals to facilitate the adoption of sustainable lifestyles. Keeping in mind that, when I was a kid, North Americans happily lived on half the energy use per capita that we use today. We are profligate, wasteful users of energy. We need programs to retrain the workforce for new forms of employment, because as energy declines, there will be an increased demand for even new types of human physical labor. We need strategies to eliminate unnecessary fossil fuel use and to reduce energy waste. Half or more of the energy consumed in our culture is wasted through inefficiencies and carelessness. We need policies to restructure global and national economies to remain within the allowable carbon budget. And by the way, recent science is suggesting there may be none, that we've actually used up all the carbon that we possibly can safely. This means we need to allocate any remaining carbon budget, and we're going to be stuck with fossil fuel for some time. So we have to reduce its use dramatically, and this means essential uses only in food production, space, water heating, interurban transportation. We need to relocalize essential economic activity. This means deglobalization in order to reduce the need for much of our energy consuming transportation, for example, something like 30% of the energy budget. We need recognition that equitable sustainability requires fiscal mechanisms for income and wealth redistribution. Notice that this is hardly something willingly discussed in our political discourse today. We need ongoing programs to ensure the restoration of ecosystems and the integrity of global life support. You can't continue to cut away the biophysical basis of your own existence. So a massive program of ecosystem restoration is necessary. And finally, there's hundreds of these, but I think this is an important one. We need a global population strategy to enable the smooth descent to the perhaps 2 billion people that might be able to live comfortably, indefinitely within the biophysical means of nature, well within carrying capacity. In short, we need nothing less than a plan, a global cooperative plan for techno-modernism to transcend and catalyze a personal to civilization level transformation to a way of being on Earth in which humans can live spiritually satisfying, economically secure lives more equitably within the means of nature. And that is the message I have for all of us today. Anybody there? Hello?
We're
Yeah, we're all
good.
here, Bill. 44 of us are still with you. 46, sorry.
That's okay.
46.
I had a
Our-
bunch of,
Our
I had
screen-
some technical problems at this end at the beginning, so I got a bit agitated, I'm afraid. Sorry about that.
It's fine. It only lasted a few seconds.
All right.
Thank you, Bill. We'll, a moment or two of quiet reflection is not inappropriate after that kind of what at one level, in another setting, would be called a good Presbyterian sermon. I'm going to ask the first question, and it's both psychologically motivated, but it's empirical. What I'm wondering about is, I hear in your voice a degree of coherence, that you've thought about this from so many different perspectives. There's a degree of thoroughness that is rare, at least that I find to be rare. You're not unique, but there are relatively few voices that are speaking the message that you convey.
So sorry, Ruben, you just disappeared there for a minute at my end. The
Did I?
sounded, yeah. So
what I'm wondering is, I hear in you a coherence that is rare. It's not unique, but it's statistically very rare. It's way less than a critical mass, which means that in effect, your voice has no impact on society at all. And what I'm wondering is, to what extent, even among colleagues and people, who are professional ecologists and others that you run into, is there a movement that you could give any kind of an estimate? At what point might there be a critical mass of voices? I mean, just thinking of even a critical mass of voices within the environmental movement. I mean, most environmentalists I know, care about the environment and all that, but they don't understand. They understand hardly any of this. They live in a dream world that somehow, if we can just be green enough, we're good to go.
mhm.
And so my question is, do you see, kind of in your own lifetime, a critical mass of voices saying this in a way? Because once there's a critical mass, whether it's liked or not, it has to be heard. When a critical mass of francophones wanted to talk about the place of Quebec in Canada, the rest of Canada said bugger off, but we had to talk to them because they were more than a critical mass. When a critical mass of women wanted to talk about the place of women, we said bugger off, but we had to talk to them because they were a critical mass. When might a critical mass of your voice begin to appear?
Well, okay, let's go back to the beginning of what you were saying. I've been extremely lucky in my life. I'm a trained scientist. I took my PhD in ecology, in life sciences, but I threw myself instantly into a different pot. So I taught my entire career in planning school, in a school of community and regional planning, which forced me to come up against the ideas of sociologists and psychologists and economists and so on. In fact, I've learned my economics in joint teaching with an economics colleague. And now there's other dimensions of this story, but the point is, I've had an extremely broad education, which started after I got my PhD. So you mentioned that I approached this from a number of different perspectives, and it's absolutely true. So I've read a great deal of human neuropsychology and neuroendocrinology and so on and so forth, the kinds of hidden things that influence our behavior. So I've been exposed to a number of perspectives that others have not. And what I'm really articulating here is a great failure of our education system, which increasingly funnels people into the most narrow of specializations, so that the vast majority of our population remains fundamentally ignorant about basic science and many of the other things that are fundamental to understanding the nature of our human dilemma. And the more specialized and advanced we become, the worse this problem becomes. There are very few generalists left who can articulate the scope of the problem that we've been talking about here. So it's a gross failure of our education system. Whether a critical mass can emerge from this remains to be seen. I don't see it forming spontaneously. Certainly more and more people are willing to hear what I have to say than was the case 20 years ago. But what seems to me to be apparent is that we need a shock, a less than fatal shock, but an enormous shock to the system before people are shaken out of their sense of whatever it is that shields us from the harsh barbs of reality. And again, I have to underscore that the social constructs that we operate from become a kind of intellectual shield against the external reality in which we are embedded. And even in Wexler's little book, he points out that once we're caught in a particular way of thinking and doing, it takes either an individual commitment to rethink things the way an alcoholic has to when they've reached rock bottom before the cure can be sustained, or it takes an external shock of extraordinary proportions to wake that person up. So that's what I'm afraid of, that all of our knowledge, the kind of thing I've been talking about, merely greases the skids and makes it perhaps a little easier for that shock to take hold once it happens. But I think we're due for a major correction. It will be imposed from outside before we're willing to act from within. And there we go.
Thank you. I'm going to ask the next question on behalf of Jeff Passmore, who had to leave. And John Meyer, you will be up next. Jeff said, have you had this conversation with any politicians? If yes, what has been the response?
Okay, the response is almost entirely negative. And so I once coined the phrase that what is politically feasible, what is politically feasible is ecologically irrelevant. And what is ecologically necessary is politically unfeasible. So again, we're caught in that dilemma where the politicians are, frankly, increasingly captive of the corporate sector, who are obviously interested mainly in maintaining the growth paradigm. And if you look at even institutions like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the discussions going on there, the people involved are all members of the corporate sector, advisors of one kind or another to government. And it's all about the technological means of maintaining the status quo. Now, many people say, well, what's wrong with that? Well, here's what's wrong with that. If we were, for example, to find a quantitative substitute for fossil fuel energy, keep in mind that energy is the means by which humans have grown the human enterprise, by scouring the earthly resources and converting all of that into the massive human artifacts. So if we have sufficient energy to continue that process, we'll simply deplete the planet until it implodes. And nevertheless, that's where our politicians are. No politicians, well, perhaps the Prime Minister of Ireland has now suggested that growth might be questionable, but certainly no politician is willing to stand up and say that we are on a wrong tack. It's time to reassess our situation and change course. I actually once wrote a paper saying that if a major politician, the President of the United States or Russia or China, were to get up in public and say these things out loud and show the leadership necessary, that might be the kind of catalyst that would be necessary to change the world around. But until that happens, we're stuck. Politicians reject absolutely anything that I've said today.
Thank you, I think. Bill Tyson, you're up. And you'll be up next. And John, your question.
Hey, Bill, thanks very much. I think we could be here for days trying to cover what you've addressed. But I'd like to look at the function of the human brain as opposed to the structure of our current economy, the elites that are now in power. Some of these elites are absolutely dependent on continued growth. The average person is not. The interest of the average Canadian, for instance, I think diverged from these elites probably in the early 60s. We didn't need any more consumption than we had now. We didn't need any more people, and we paid an economic and social price for growth. But basically, so that's my question. It's not just, is our social structure and the elites currently in power, the interests of these elites that dictate social policy and also the national conversation. because the media now is completely controlled by growth interests. And that's why you're not hearing the discussion, because in the 50 years I've been covering this, I've been dealing with these issues, I find a tremendous change in public attitude to growth and population growth. And I think we see that really distilled in the pandemic. People are changing their attitudes. People are open to the suggestion that maybe we should change, but you don't see it in the media. So I think that the human brain is functioning maybe better than you give it credit for, but it's not enabled. This adjustment, possible adjustment, is not being enabled. It's being suppressed by economic interests and the power elite. What would you say to that?
Well, I did say that more and more people are willing to listen to the arguments that I'm presenting, but it doesn't make any difference if on the policy front, we're continuing to go forward. Look at the pandemic. The way Trudeau has approached this, I've heard him say 100 times now that the economy will come roaring back. So, and most people talk about, we want to return to normal. We want to return to normal. And I'm talking about people that you're talking about who are relatively well informed. What they don't realize is that normal is the problem. Normal is the problem. We have to shift out of normal into a new way of thinking and doing and being on this planet if we're going to get out of this issue. So most people today, yes, they're receptive to change and all of that, but the kind of change they're receptive to is marginal reform of the system. We're going to move to green energy and all of this sort of thing. They haven't done the arithmetic. We need some people to stand up and broadcast what this really means in terms of the impacts on the planet. There will be no green energy transition. Do you really think that 1 year from now, Canada will be using 7% less fossil fuel than it is now? The answer is no. And in fact, if you even look on government's own websites, the Canada Energy Agency talks about, well, we might be down to 30% less fossil fuel by 2050. Come on, it's not even in the ballpark of what's needed.
Yeah, Canada hasn't kept its word on any of these, and there's
No, of course not.
We don't have a strategy, we don't have monitoring, so it's guaranteed failure. But I do think we would have a more informed debate, an informed discussion that, if the financial interests of the extreme elites were not so radically different from A, the welfare of the planet, and B, the welfare of the average individual. But anyway, great answer. Thanks very much. And Ruben, back to you.
Bill Tyson, you're up, and Anitra, you'll be next.
Okay, can you hear me all right?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Good, okay. Bill, that was an excellent presentation. You put things really very clearly. I wonder if you ever feel like a modern Elijah. Prophets of old had a great deal of difficulty getting the message. I wonder, we started to talk about politicians not listening. I have worse concerns than that. I think that the electorate just doesn't listen. Politics, the politicians reflect what they think they can get across to their electorate. I wonder if we really need something like an enlightened monarchy or an enlightened dictatorship. I really despair about democracy ever getting us out of this mess.
Well, it would be nice. I just don't think that there's any such thing. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. It's not an original observation, by the way, but I think it's a truth. So democracy may be terrible, but it's what we've got going for us right now. Having said that, it seems to me that the thing that will move us forward is more and more protests in the street. Democracy really means people standing up on their hind legs and expressing themselves effectively in the political arena. The more the economy is being structured to leave people behind, the more likely is civil insurrection of one kind or another in the years coming ahead. We're already seeing hints of this. Just look at what happened in the United States a couple of months ago, but it's also happening in different parts of Europe, where people are getting fed up to the teeth with the nature of the situation in which they find themselves and the unresponsiveness of the political and corporate system to the nature of our dilemma. And by the way, it's not all good, because we see, as I've emphasized, increasing factions on the far right, on the far left, different people adhering to dramatically different social constructs of the way they perceive reality. So religious fundamentalism, extreme right political discourse, extreme leftism taking over in the United States and even in Canada in the universities, where we're reforming the language to reflect a particular social construct rather than the nature of reality. So we're seeing, I think, a breakdown in social cohesion, in part because of the failure of the media, in part because of the gross failure of our education system, but also in part of the absence of real leadership of politicians who stand up and say what the evidence tells us. We're seeing more and more leadership by poll rather than leadership by intelligent politicians who, grab the bit in their teeth and take us in a direction. That's why I said, if we had just one major politician who stood up and said some intelligent things based on the evidence, we could crack this and at least get the discourse moving in the right direction. Even the popular media would be forced to pick up the discussion and move it through society.
Thank you. Ted Manning, you'll be next. Anitra, your question.
Well, thank you, Bill, for an excellent presentation. And as somebody who's thought about this since Limits of Growth, which is 5 decades ago, I'm very interested in your opinion of what comes at this point in the peak if very grounded, intelligent solutions could suddenly, and obviously we would have to do them very rapidly, be put all into effect, multi-solutions at the same time. For instance, China was very moderately successful in one child, one family, and other solutions like reforestation is happening in major places around the world, regeneration of the sea, eating much lower on the food web, and I'm talking primarily vegetables and some cultivated seafoods, which could be in 75% of the world's surface, which is now really not used for growing foods, and limiting many other things, and that we don't use these high-tech things like atom bombs to kill one another and create, quote, security, but we use fairly straightforward and multiple, and everybody's using them, techniques. Do you think that this creates some kind of opportunity, this kind of scenario, or do you think the die is cast and it's we're just on the way out no matter what we do?
I don't think we're on our way out no matter what we do, but I do think almost everything you've talked about is still focusing on technological solutions rather than just facing the reality. We need to use less and we need fewer people consuming less. And until those things are addressed directly, it doesn't matter what we do, because all of the technological solutions being put forward, because every single action is dissipative, will require energy, will require the throughput of more materials. Such things as the circular economy, green growth, the Green New Deal, they're meaningless. These are just fantasies set out there to lull people into confidence that we can move forward through technological change. We need to have a conversation around how do we reduce consumption, how do we reduce human populations until we are beneath the productive and carrying capacities of this planet Earth. And until we're there, we're continuing to erode the basis of our own existence. And that won't last too long. You know, we can cross a tripping point. One of the great Antarctic ice sheets breaks off, and we can have a 3-meter sea level rise in a matter of a decade. And that's game over for most of our coastal cities. So we are at that point where we need to make those serious changes and stop thinking technology is going to pull us through this.
Rob.
Barry Bruce, you'll be up next. Ted Manning, your question.
Yeah, Bill, that was wonderful. I'm at, am I on yet?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, hi. Yeah, I'm at great risk of agreeing with you, Bill. I thought that was wonderful. I've been in risk management for a long, long time. And we always come to the conclusion that nobody does anything until they're panicked. And I guess what I'm asking is, how panicked do they have to get? And is there any hope that an institution could happen that might, in fact, react significantly before it's too late?
Well, this is a conversation that could go on for a very long time. Now, I'm a biologist, so a great deal of my presentation was based on certain biological realities.
Mhm.
Another biological reality is that human beings evolved to be optimists. Now, optimism is a state of mind. We want to be hopeful about the future. But when you're in a crisis situation, unwarranted optimism and hope can be enervating. They can destroy the motivation to move forward, because we tend to think, well, somebody else will handle the problem, or the technologists will fix it, or the scientists will, or whatever. So I'm not too encouraged that we would get the kind of innovative thing that you're thinking about, Ted, that it's going to emerge from anything short of, and I think you already agreed with me, some kind of micro catastrophe, not fatal to the planet, but big enough to get people to sit up and take notice. In some ways, you know, the pandemic is a lesson in that direction. We've seen more government action in response to this pandemic than to any other crisis in my lifetime. Yet it's a relatively minor crisis when you really think about the numbers of people being affected. We may have a few million deaths by the time it's over, but we add 85 million people to the planet every year. So it's a drop in the bucket, but it does show the extent to which we can move dramatically if under the gun. And so I'm hoping
you can actually get the attention of a politician when you have your hand on their wallet, and just look at what's about to happen in the energy sector if Gretchen Whitmer decides to cut off
absolutely
all the gas. Could well be a stimulating event. I don't know it'll be enough, but it may actually get the politicians' attention.
Fair enough.
Rob Hoffman, you'll be up next. Barry Bruce, your question.
Thank you very much, Bill. That was a wonderful presentation. I was struck by the idea that climate change is a symptom, and that root causes lie in our own brains. And I'm wondering about education. I think it selectively affects our cerebrum, which you've said is dominated by our limbic and reptilian brains. And I wonder how we get around that. Will we have to actually endure a drastic drop in our population and perhaps hope that people with dominant cerebrums will emerge as mutants?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if this is a non-actionable but serious root cause. How do we get around that?
Well, that to me is a critical question. And I think one way is to at least raise to consciousness. Most people aren't aware that their decision-making is not something that takes place entirely in the cerebral hemispheres, that beneath that, there will be an influence of your emotional state, of your instinctive response to the same circumstances. But we're not conscious of that. All we are conscious of is that which goes on in the thinking part of our brain. So we have to make people aware that they are actually being influenced by these other elements. So once that is understood, you at least open the door to the possibility that we can create social institutions that override our instinctive and emotional responses. Do you understand what I'm saying? In fact, if you think of civilization, I often think of civilization as that set of rules and regulations that inhibit that which would otherwise occur. Even something as simple as not murdering somebody who offends you, that's the natural response to an enemy. Well, we impose rules that make that less probable. It doesn't always work, but at least it's less probable. Human beings are not monogamists. We tend to be somewhat more promiscuous, but we create a social institution called marriage and a legal framework to sustain it, which doesn't always work again, but at least it's a framework that controls the behavior so that we can live together reasonably well in society. So what I'm really arguing here, Bruce, Barry, is that we need to raise to consciousness that much of our lives are dominated, if not dominated, at least influenced by subliminal, emotional, and instinctive contexts that have to be overridden in the right circumstances if we're going to pull through. Now, part of the problem is this. One of the things that makes us negative is any perceived threat to our own well-being. So people who have acquired a certain political power or economic power, once we have those things, we're extremely reluctant to give them up. So any threat to our perceived economic power or our social status is resisted mightily, not rationally. Again, we're not primarily a rational species, but we have to be aware that the way we are acting is determined by a primitive instinct that worked, by the way. These things didn't evolve by happenstance. These things worked 10,000 years ago, but they don't work in the kind of circumstances that we've created today. So let me reiterate that, because again, it's an extremely important point that is missing entirely from our education system, for example. That human beings evolved in a certain way that was appropriate for the kind of unchanging environmental circumstances that we evolved in tribes even up to 10,000 years ago. But today we need to be able to move rapidly, quickly in response to rapid environmental change. And we simply don't have the mental or societal agility to respond as rapidly as the circumstances require, unless we raise all of that to consciousness and realize that we've got to, or else. That's probably not a good answer, but it's as good as I can.
Well, it was great. I think maybe the flaw in my thinking was assuming that education only appeals to our rational brain, but perhaps education, and I think there are probably instances of education appealing to the lower brain as well. And maybe I think what you're saying is education needs to change to approach those aspects of our thinking. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Dave Doherty, you'll be up next. Rob Hoffman, your question.
Yes. Hi, Bill. Good to
How
see
you doing,
you.
Rob? Yeah.
Very well. Great presentation. Thanks very much. I have a question, but I'll make a comment first of all. I think we would agree that Homo sapiens, we human beings, are ill-equipped to understand the complex systems in which we exist. To use Stafford Beer's terms, as you did, our models of reality that we hold don't map well enough onto the external reality. So my question is, can we use technology, or can we find technology that would enhance our capacity to understand the reality? just as we have discovered telescopes and microscopes that help us understand aspects of that reality better than we could have without them.
That's a very interesting question, and I think you've gone way beyond my depth in that domain. But I do want to pick up on something you said, and that's really very important. Humans evolved in small tribal groups. You might meet another 100 people in the course of your entire lifetime. You had a limited home range with a small array of ecosystems over which you had almost no control or influence. That's not quite true, because we were quite prolific hunters and so on and so forth. But the fact is that we evolved to deal with relatively simple circumstances and situations. The human brain is not capable of wrapping itself around the kind of world that we have created. Nobody understands really how the internet works, or the economy, or the political system. Each of these things is a complex system, and our whole society is an overlay of multiple complex systems, each one of which is beyond the capacity for any one person to really understand how it behaves. So Stafford Beer's warning, in a sense, is almost universal. It is the case that whatever social construct we come up with, whatever model we come up with, will not contain a sufficiently rich array of the external reality that we're going to be able to maintain control over it, right? I think we're in a situation now where what will take us down in the end, if something does, may not even be on the horizon, may not even be something we thought about. It's going to be some hidden systemic tipping point over which we cross and take us down completely, and it's something we didn't even think about. Pandemic, whoever thought of pandemics before a year and a half ago as something that would have such a disruptive impact on society? Well, perhaps a handful of people. But the fact is, we're absolutely subject to surprise, and the more we push these systems to their limits, the more likely the surprise will be something in the category of unknown unknowns. And so you've put your finger absolutely on it. What technologies could raise awareness of that to consciousness? I don't know. But I think the best answer is to back off. Don't keep poking the bear, because at some point it's going to lose its temper and come after you. And that's the situation we're in now. Growth is simply poking the bear, and the ecosphere is a big bear.
Art Hunter, you will be up next. Dave Doherty, your question.
Yeah, thanks for that talk, Bill. Wow, you took me back to my education in the 70s. But there's so much new material that you added to it. It was fascinating. So my question is about whether well-being, with all the increased consumption of food and energy and other resources, has actually increased. Aside from our ability to fight infectious disease, and perhaps the fact that we have a bit less war than we did, are we really better off than our grandparents were?
Well, again, that's a question sociologists and psychologists and a whole lot of other people are asking. But we do have a series of annual tests given since the late 50s, or perhaps even just after the war, on the state of happiness in North America and in some countries in Europe. And what we've seen is a negative correlation between rising GDP per capita and the numbers of people who report themselves as being happy or very happy. So that there's no direct correlation any longer, if there ever was. Well, I'm sure there was in rising out of poverty, but certainly we've lost any correlation between rising per capita consumption or income and the state of well-being. So a reduction in throughput doesn't necessarily mean a reduction in well-being. Humans were happiest in North America in the late 1950s. And that's a long time ago, and during a period of the most rapid expansion of the economy in the history of humankind. So I think there's a huge lesson to be taken there. And I did have one slide that pointed out we used half as much stuff per capita in the 50s as we do now. And we were a lot happier back then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was pretty sure you have some facts regarding that. That was my opinion as well.
Yeah.
Thanks.
There's another really important thing to take into account here. Since the 1970s, particularly since the publication of something called, oh dear me, I forget the name of it, but it was a manifesto. A direction from a corporate lawyer to the US Chamber of Commerce that Lewis Powell. Look this up. I think everyone should be aware of the Lewis Powell Memorandum, 1971, I believe, under the Nixon administration to the US Chamber of Commerce, in which he directed the corporate sector to begin the conscious, I suppose, reframing of political discourse in North America, to get away from the dangerous notions of community, of environment, of civil rights, of women's liberation, and those sorts of things, which were becoming current in discussion in North American society. And he instructed the corporate sector to pile increasing amounts of resources into refuting all of that. And if necessary, to establishing departments of economics and private think tanks to reassert corporate values in American society. Now, this wasn't the only thing that did it, but it was the beginning of the period, which, you know, some people mark with the Rager, Thatcher, and Mulroney era in the 80s. A decade before that, Lewis Powell set up the environment in which we went from a handful, maybe 10 think tanks in North America, to several hundred dedicated to promoting the corporate values, to diminishing the notion of the public good or the common wealth. So we saw things such as, again, anybody can look this up. When Eisenhower was president, the marginal tax rate for the top 1% in the United States was 90% was the marginal tax rate. Today it's 34, 37%, something of that nature. So every president, liberal or rather Democratic or Republican, since the 1970s has added to this continuous inflation of corporate wealth and of the 1% at the expense of most other people in America. It's not so bad in Canada, but it's getting there. So that right now, the top 1% command something like 80% of the new income from growth in the United States. The bottom 50% are worse off in just about every terms. And if you read a little book called The Spirit Level, Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, The Spirit Level, you will find that as wealth disparity increases in a society, all of the indicators of population health declines. Alcoholism, marital breakups, drug addiction, and all of those things get worse and worse and worse. So that as the income disparity has increased in North America, in the United States in particular, the US is now at the very bottom of the OECD heap in terms of population health. So that again, it underscores that although wealth has increased enormously, the misappropriation or misallocation or misdistribution of that wealth is resulting in a major social catastrophe unfolding, which may lead to the unraveling of the whole of society at some point. Check it out.
I did. I found a link which I put in the chat box to a Bill Moyer's item on it.
Oh yeah, very good. And again, Pickett and Richard Wilkinson and Pickett's little book called The Spirit Level is a great eye-opener for people who aren't familiar with the role of income, wealth, the inequality that is rife in our society and getting worse by the day.
Yeah, when I was at Health Canada, one of the things I studied was the Gini coefficient.
Yeah.
Which back in the 90s was around 32, something like that in Canada, and it's around 40 now, and it's gone from about 35 in the States to around 50.
Yeah.
And Gini coefficient, as it rises, indicates that more and more of the wealth is going to fewer and fewer of the people.
Yeah.
And in fact, that's one of the things that leads me to believe that our well-being is worse now than it was.
It is. That's exactly what Wilkinson and Pickett's book would show you, as well as those psychology studies.
Thanks.
Thank you. I'm Mary Hagan. You'll be up next. Art Hunter, your question.
Well, Bill, I guess we've been through quite a number of speakers in this series of Cake or Zooms, and they all have a general theme which you've really capped and encapsulated just about everyone. And I've come to the point of saying, no matter how humanity organizes itself and whatever wonderful moves are being made in the economic sphere or technology or it's going to be too late anyway. We're heading in to a correction, a population correction of some type, and I suspect it's going to be quite substantial. But I'm interested in your comments as to whether this population correction, if I'm correct, is inevitable. Is it going to be driven by mankind going to war with each other over depleting resources, food, water, and all those things which we want to collect and use to maintain our standard of living? Or is nature going to do it for us? Have you thought about that? And who do you think is going to win this race to do the correction?
It's not a race you want to win, is it? Look, who was it who said that making predictions is very difficult, especially if it's about the future? So I'm not a prognosticator. I just look at the trends. And what the trends say to me is that we're on a very difficult tack. I think all of the prospects or possibilities that you've raised are possible. I mean, one of the reasons for the explosive expansion of humankind was the use of fossil fuels to increase our access to all other resources needed to grow the human enterprise. So from a biological point of view, what we did was release humanity from the negative feedbacks that had kept us in check for 350,000 years. Now, at some point, they come back into play. So for example, we're all excited about renewable energy, but if we had another couple of hours, I think I could demonstrate conclusively that there's no possibility of renewable energy quantitatively replacing fossil fuel in the next 10, 15, 20, or 30 years. It's just not going to happen. So we're caught between a rock and a hard place in the sense that we should get out of fossil fuel to avoid catastrophic climate change, but we can't get out of fossil fuel because our whole society, the production of food, our transportation systems, the construction of our cities and so on is utterly dependent on abundant, cheap energy. So if we were to abandon fossil fuel because of the existence of massive climate change, there's going to be huge food problems. Starvation will be a fact of the matter. Other resources will get scarce. Global trade will break down because we can no longer rely on the supply lines that have been built up as a result of globalization. By the way, globalization is arguably the single greatest threat to ecological integrity on the planet, because what it does is enable rich, high dense populations vastly to exceed their domestic carrying capacities, but then leech on the rest of the world to continue the growth mode at home. So countries like China, they have something called the Belts and Road program right now, which is designed to siphon the world's resources to maintain the appetite of the growing Chinese behemoth. But it's only what Europeans and Americans did before that. So we have a situation where we use the marketplace as the means by which the wealthy siphon all the remaining resources from the rest of the world. But if that begins to break down, you have literally tens of millions of people in megacities who are going to be cut off from their sources of supply. So that introduces the problem of massive interregional migration. We're already seeing this beginning at the southern US border and in the Mediterranean in Europe. These are just leading edges of what lies ahead as climate change breaks down our capacity to maintain our cities and civilization. We're going to see, as a result of that, increasing global strife in the conflict between nations over the remaining pockets of resources, and so on and so forth. We will see a breakdown in society's capacity to manage things like this pandemic. What would it be like in the absence of the scientific research and the development on a record scale of several vaccines, unprecedented in human history? Well, without that, this plague would have been vastly worse than it has been. But what I'm saying is, on our current trajectory, all of these things will get worse. I think there's no question about that. So I will repeat, perhaps I hope for the last time, the only solution to this problem is to back off, to recognize the trajectory that we are on is one which leads inevitably to an implosion that will be imposed by the return of negative feedback, big time. It'll be imposed by nature, in other words. And our only option is to rise to that true human capacity, to exercise our intelligence, to exercise our ability to plan ahead, to exercise our ability to cooperate at an unprecedented level, to remove ourselves from the inordinate problem that we have created. We have created this problem. We can solve it, but we're not going to solve it through geoengineering or any of the other massive investment strategies that are designed specifically to keep the system going as it is and further alter the life support functions of the planet. Good question.
Thank
Maybe
you.
not a good answer, but there it is.
Oh, wonderful answer.
If one were editing this tape, that would be a lovely place to stop. There are 3 additional questions, and if you'll put up with a bit of extension of time, we'll allow them to be asked. Susan Tanner, you'll be next. Mary Hagan, your question.
Hi, Bill. It's Mary
Hi.
Hagan from Ottawa. And I've been a secret admirer of you for years, and ask a specific question for now, because I want to take you back to when you studied and taught about communities. And I'm thinking more of geographical communities as we were starting to build our big cities, etc. And feeling that people, at least people around me, hopefully in North America, are looking back, are regrouping, and are really centering more of their activities and their actions because it's more under their control at the moment versus the big government, the big corporate controls on their local neighborhood and how I'm going to survive and not go back to the old way of living. And it often is quite mixed up in the well-being of my families. And as we, for a moment, might be consuming a little less and probably traveling a little less, are sort of finding new joys in life. So could you please speak to me about your learnings of communities and how we might apply it today?
Whoa. Do we have another 3 hours to deal with this? Look,
Yes.
one of the things that we've lost, I think, in recent years, I alluded to this earlier, is that sense that we're all in this together. The sense of community has definitely been eroded, particularly in North America, perhaps not quite so much in Europe. And I think the pandemic has given us an opportunity to begin to rediscover, just as you said, some of the benefits of community. So I've been a great fan of what I call relocalization, the reestablishment of many economic activities at the community level that we now depend on elsewhere. I mean, we import bread from California here in British Columbia, which is an absurdity. And yet, bakers are closing up because we can't get customers in town. So there's all sorts of ways that if we took it seriously to relocalize, to make a community the foundation upon which we all live. Nobody, in the end, dies saying they wish they'd spent more time at the office, as somebody once said. What seems to be important to people is the quality of the relationships that they develop in the course of their lives. And that means family, friends, and of course, a community. So that is the foundation of human health and happiness. And yet we've set in place a system which has eroded systematically the foundation of community, explicitly and on purpose, to eliminate the sense of the common good, the sense that we're in things together. Even the internet, which enables us to enter into little narrow echo chambers, I think is the word that people use, is tending to erode the basis of good community activity. So there's a real opportunity here, but it has to be, again, raised to consciousness. More and more people have to become aware of this. And yet, to go back to what someone said much earlier, the corporate media aren't playing to that theme. That's what they should be playing to. Instead, we talk always on the news about the need to get back to normal. People want to travel, they want to buy more. Look at the pent-up demand. How many times have you heard on the news the fact that the economy is going to explode as soon as this pandemic is over because people have saved money and just can't wait to get out there and spend it, traveling or new cars or whatever it might be. So we have this, again, human beings are a conflicted species, enormously torn between what we ought to be doing to save ourselves and the directions we are being taken by the forces that we socially construct in society to create the beliefs, values, and assumptions under which the majority of people operate. So I suppose one of the most hopeful signs is that there are small groups of people who become, I suppose, catalytic of major change. And when the time comes, that catalyst may spread through society. But for the most part, I see the mainstream as holding its own and doing everything it can to ensure that it's reestablished once this temporary crisis is over.
Very interesting. I think I will continue doing what I do every day.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And Zach Jacobson, the last question is yours.
Gosh, listen, that was a wonderful talk. Thank you for it. And thank you so much for ruining my lunch.
Sorry about that.
No, it's all right. I'm trying to see ways through it. I got to tell you, first of all, don't underestimate the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. It's what Art Hunter is talking about. A terrible population crunch. However, which in some sense, it could be worse. There are days when I think of that as optimism. Mm-hmm. There was a time when there were somewhat 6,000 Homo sapiens on the planet, and that was a crunch. Well, I worry that the next crunch, however, is onrushing, and it is climate-based, and it will kill even the 6,000. There won't be anybody left, which leads me to this. There's always, and in your talk, and others I can name, the notion, well, technology isn't going to save us. We've got to do something to live our minds differently. I don't know that we've even got the time for that. So I'm going to say, I think, don't throw out the technology babies with the bathwater. The notion that Robert Hoffman has that we'll hope for something, although the idea of hoping for some technology scares me. The technologies I like, which everybody hates around here, including you, are nuclear energy and geoengineering. I don't think they'll save all of the world, but I hope they'll save a corporal's guard of humanity to go on and make some more mistakes. But that was a comment. That was an editorial. Thank you for a wonderful talk and a ruined lunch.
Well, now look here. I have to do something. Okay. I've been, shouted off stages for being pessimistic. People don't want to hear this. And I keep saying, I'm not being pessimistic. What I'm doing is elevating to consciousness the opportunity for us to make the kinds of changes necessary to move beyond this. There's no point in wallowing in ignorance or just literally ignorance, ignoring the oncoming reality. So I'm sorry I spoiled your lunch, but I think on the whole, if you've taken anything from this, it's that there is a way out of this, but before you cure You have to diagnose the disease properly. And we have misdiagnosed the nature of our own ailment so profoundly that the prescriptions we're taking are going to kill us. Secondly, optimism and pessimism. These are states of mind. They have nothing to do with reality. I like to think of myself as a realist. I look at the data, I look at the trends, I look at what's happened historically, and I attempt to interpret these things in some kind of realistic way. Hope is another thing. One of my friends uses the word hopium. Hope is a drug if you don't use it to stimulate action in a way that makes a real difference. So look, we're stuck, we're in a problem here. You're absolutely right. It can spoil a lot of lunches, but if in so doing, it raises to consciousness the fact that this is the nature of our dilemma, we can diagnose it better, we can propose things that might move us through us, then by all means, take this as a message of the strongest possible motivation. By the way, I really do think people are much more motivated by having the shit scared out of them than they are by being hopeless.
Yes.
And on
I don't
that,
know if it got across, but what I said was yes.
I saw that.
and on that note, and given the hour, Bill, it falls to me to thank you. You can tell from the questions that have come, from the fact that folks are still around, that we have worked at hearing what you're saying. That one of the blessings of KCOR is that it attracts a non-trivial audience. And you have come in the best of the prophetic tradition that says if you stay on the path you're headed on, you're in deep trouble. You may want to think about the path you're on. And for that, I am thankful. I'm glad that this will be on YouTube, and I'm glad that your slides will be made available to us. So on behalf of KCOR and those who will watch it later by video, thank you. And we'll do this again sometime.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, Ruben. And again, apologies for the little technical smuck up at the beginning. That was shameful.
That's the biggest crisis of the day. It's a good day.
Thank you.